on behalf of OECI. I'm going to begin with hopefully a slide which will come up. Excellent. I'm going to talk more about trends and developments that I see in that we see in OECI in European comprehensive cancer centers, rather than doing a detailed anatomy of structures, if I may. And I'm going to begin with just a list of evidence that exists, particularly in the United States, for better patient outcomes from specialist centers, particularly the NCI-designated comprehensive cancer centers, in some cases showing a 15% better outcome for patients over the next class of cancer of hospitals within the United States. There is coming some evidence of better outcomes in Europe as well from the specialist centers, but there's quite a body of evidence. But of course, immediately, although that's welcome news in some senses and justifies the position and the uniqueness of comprehensive cancer centers, in terms of inequalities also poses a problem, doesn't it? Because our estimate is that, depending on the member state, between 10% and 40% of patients only are treated in comprehensive cancer centers or have access to them at the moment. And the EU target for that is 90% by 2030. How is that going to be achieved? Only by effective networking around the comprehensive cancer center. Now, that is a real challenge to us all. But what is keeping comprehensive cancer centers directors awake at night? And OECI has been talking to our directors, who of course have responsibility for clinical care and their patients, as well as for research and for education. And probably the number one thing is actually workforce, which we haven't covered in detail at the session yet. New skills required in bioinformatics, etc. Strain and burnout among clinicians. There's a horrible statistic in Europe that in a third of member states, 40% of the cancer workforce are over 55 and nearing retirement. A strain and burnout, particularly in the post-COVID era. Vacant posts we're seeing in OECI centers, between 10 and 15% nursing vacancies, huge vacancies in pathology, very significant vacancies in radiology, and therefore the challenge of recruiting and training the right people. There's an awful lot of interesting work going on about skill mix in the clinic and actually breaking down the silos of the professions. An awful lot of good work going on, particularly in the Nordic countries, actually, and in the Northern European member states, on developing the nursing profession to a high degree to take on more work. But that, of course, imposes its own strain and poses a particular challenge to continuous professional education of all the skills in the workforce. In the green box, of course, there are big things also keeping directors awake at night on implementing precision cancer medicine in practice. We've heard quite a lot of great examples around the table about that whole process. We see many different ways of, at the clinical end, implementing molecular tumor boards. We see pressures on bioinformatics, as I've said. AI had a glorious exposition, and actually relating that to the workforce. I think the challenge really for cancer center directors is there's no point in trying to do the same work in the same way with fewer people. There have to be practice changes, whether it's in follow-up, risk stratification. You know, in Cambridge, when I first started there were 8 follow-up appointments, generally speaking, for every one new patient. And that simply is not a sustainable model face-to-face in the future. We've heard the challenges of data and integrity, sharing, permissions, secondary use of data, volume, sheer volume of data, and challenges of biobanking and clinical and data links. And then, and I'll say a bit more about this later on in the presentation, the challenges of developing new areas of research, which were mentioned in Ulrich's great talk on prevention research, outcomes research, implementation science, and how to build collaborations with other centers to pursue these challenges. And what is OECI learning about quality within our own certified cancer centers in Europe? Just to remind you, we have within our membership 123 cancer centers in Europe, the large ones, and of those, 65 have gone through a full certification of their clinical care, their research, and their education. On the very positive side, we published some of these results 18 months ago in Molecular Oncology. On the positive side of things, we're seeing that clinical multidisciplinarity is now well embedded. It is a standard of care in all centers. We're seeing better pathway-directed care, but some of the recording systems are not always brilliant. We are generally seeing better use of data and IT, but there are challenges which I'll mention in a moment, and much better patient involvement and patient centricity in most of our centers. On the neutral level in the bottom left, we see that precision medicine is being implemented certainly at all the larger CCCs, but without that level of standardization and consistency that is required. And we're finding when we look at the concentration of research, that high quality research appears to be concentrated, I would think, in about 40 to 50 of the centers in Europe. And the same is true of the volume and leadership of clinical trials, and I'll show some stats on that in a moment. But when it comes to governance, the structures that we see, particularly in comprehensive cancer centers in university hospitals, are not often optimal to guarantee the best integration of research and care. But I will give an example from my old alma mater in Cambridge in a moment. And we know that there's a long way to go on the secondary use of data for research. And that the importance of outreach, which is often a German way of describing local networks, comprehensive cancer networks around the comprehensive cancer centers. So let's have a look at the contributions of CCCs to peer-reviewed cancer research per year compared to smaller or medium-sized cancer centers. What that simple box plot shows is that the median academic output of CCCs belonging to OECI is 4 times higher than their clinical center equivalents, even though some of those clinical centers are large, some often university hospitals or huge general hospitals. And so we see this concentration of translational research, particularly output, in peer-reviewed papers. And the same is true when it comes to clinical trials. On the left, you see a plot, the clinical centers are on the left, the comprehensive centers are on the right of each box plot, and you see the median CCC has 4 times as many open clinical trials as their small or medium-sized cancer center equivalents. The same with the number of patients recruited. But look on the right-hand side, the number of early phase trials. I mean, there is a 10-fold difference there. And this tries to answer the question of the critical mass required to be a really effective and high-performing comprehensive cancer center. Now, on structure of comprehensive cancer centers, I'm just going to mention 2 examples of how at Cambridge we have addressed this. The Cambridge Cancer Center is a virtual center. It is not a legal entity. It is not even a very formal, structural uniting of the university hospital, the University of Cambridge, and the 7 constituent research institutes. The numbers along the bottom there are the numbers of PIs and clinical consultants, including consultants in pathology and radiology, etc., who are members of what we call foundational programs, many of which are tumor-specific, ovarian cancer, urological cancers, etc., but some discipline-specific programs in advanced cancer imaging, cellular and molecular biology, cancer immunology, nursing, and allied healthcare. So the important thing about these programs is they are co-led by a clinician and by a scientist, or if you're lucky, a clinical scientist, a clinician scientist. And These programs are given a small amount of seed corn funding, and they are each given a program manager who is a scientist who does not pursue science, but whose sole object is to pursue the program, to help get grants, to help organize the program, to do simple things like organizing breakfast meetings between engineers and physicists and biologists and clinicians and patients. And as those foundational programs become successful in terms of their academic or clinical trials production, they can then progress to become virtual institutes. We see examples there in breast cancer medicine, integrated cancer medicine, which is the Cambridge terminology for precision cancer medicine, and brain tumor at a brain tumor institute, often with some charitable funding to underpin that. And when those virtual institutes become really successful, they can then have a building and progress to become what we would know as a physical institute. The latest one of those is the Cancer Research UK, ICE Clinical Early Cancer Institute, which is led by Rebecca Fitzgerald. Many of you know her. There's also Milner Therapeutics and the long-standing, of course, CRUK, Cambridge Institute. Those are numbers of PIs, not numbers of scientists in those boxes. So you see a progression that is possible. But this principle of having a programmatic approach to bringing together the science and the clinical care is absolutely axiomatic to Cambridge's progress. So you see that each of those groups has not just got the usual suspects, but has got physicists, behavioral scientists, computational biologists, of course, etc. And don't forget nursing and allied health professionals on the clinical side. I want to change tack very slightly and just mention what is happening in the EU for creating an EU network of comprehensive cancer centres. This is a 2-year preparatory joint action led by my good colleague Tit Albrecht behind me. It involves 24 of the 27 member states, and its object within 2 years is to prepare for the creation of an EU network of comprehensive cancer centres. There are, of course, existing certified CCCs, both in my own organisation, OECI, and in German Cancer Aid. But what has to happen is to map the potential for more CCCs in Europe, and this could be up to 160 or 200 centres, depending on the political will. And important challenges there to define the added value of what this network is going to achieve and to achieve a consensus for the core standards for these comprehensive cancer centres. I think Tit, as the coordinator of this, would agree with me that there are challenges. The EU is putting incredible time pressure on the creation of this network. There's going to be the challenges of the different sizes and variation of those comprehensive cancer centers, the very large ones that we know about, to comparatively medium-sized ones in some of the smaller member states. How are they going to be financed? How is this network going to be financed in the future? And what is the perception of the network going to be? Is it going to be an enabling network or a regulatory network? And is the network going to be holistic in its comprehensiveness, or to what extent is it going to be organ-based? So these are the challenges that have to be addressed and are being very ably addressed at the moment within this particular action. Now, I want to say a little bit about a publication which was not the moonshot, but the Lancet Oncology Groundshot, a publication in November last year. I have to pay tribute to Mark Lawler and to Richard Sullivan for being the main authors of this. And it is probably one of the most comprehensive reviews of cancer research in Europe over the sort of meta-study of what's going on in terms of cancer research in the last few years. What these graphs show is in the older member states of the EU, in the red, the EU 15, in those 11 years between 2009 and 2020, there's been a doubling of cancer research. But sadly, in the EU 13, in the blue, there's been stagnation over that nine-year period and little progress in that. And that is something that needs to be urgently addressed. I'm looking across at my good colleague Peter here from Budapest. These centres really need to benefit from twinning and teaming approaches to enable this to be addressed. The funding gap needs to be addressed. The United States per capita is spending 234 euros, I may use the word euros, on cancer research compared to 26 euros per head in Europe. There's a tenfold difference. So this urgently needs to be addressed, and how we spend it is also an urgent need. This graph shows the very low point in the third bar chart is the amount of euros spent on prevention research compared to biology, etiology, and treatment. And the last bar chart shows how much is being spent on cancer control and survivorship research. Again, woefully low, and it needs to be addressed. So we need to widen the cancer research portfolio in Europe to include all disease phases, all cancer types, all modalities, and an emphasis on health policy and outcomes research, systems research, and implementation science. And that final slide I now see is too small, really, to make much use of. But I think is my final slide. These are the 12 points that the Lancet Oncology Commission paper wishes to address as policy objectives, including in number 8, deploying comprehensive cancer centers as powerhouses for cancer research and translation into superior clinical care. And with that, I conclude and thank you for your attention.